Have you ever experienced a moment that completely shattered your world? A single image so devastating that it replayed in your mind like a broken record, refusing to let you find peace? For Margaret Thompson, that moment came on a cold, November afternoon when she spotted a familiar figure on the corner of 5th and Main, her own daughter, Sarah, standing in tattered clothes with a cardboard sign and a baby wrapped in a thin blanket, pressed against her chest. The woman who had once walked across a stage to receive her college diploma, who had married in a beautiful ceremony just 3 years prior, who had promised to call every Sunday, was now begging for spare change from strangers. Margaret's grocery bags slipped from her hands, oranges rolling across the sidewalk as her world tilted on its axis. What had happened to her bright, ambitious daughter? Where was her son-in-law, David? And why was her granddaughter, oh, a child she didn't even know, existed, shivering in the November wind? This is a story about the fragility of life, the complexity of family bonds, and the extraordinary lengths a mother will go to save her child. It's about pride, forgiveness, and discovering that sometimes the hardest journey is the one that brings us back home. If you're moved by stories of family, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between mother and child, subscribe to hear more true stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. Margaret had always considered herself a woman of composure. Through 32 years of marriage, the loss of her own mother, and the daily challenges of running a small accounting firm, she had maintained an admirable grace under pressure. Her friends often remarked on her steady demeanor, the way she could face a crisis with clear eyes and a level head. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for the sight of her daughter on that street corner. The recognition didn't come immediately. Margaret had been thinking about dinner, mentally cataloging the contents of her grocery bags. Chicken breast, fresh vegetables, a bottle of white wine for the weekend. She had been looking forward to a quiet evening at home with her husband, Robert, perhaps watching one of those British detective shows they both enjoyed. Her mind was occupied with these mundane thoughts when something made her glance to her right. At first, it was just a young woman with a baby. The city had its share of homeless individuals, and while Margaret always felt a pang of sympathy, she had learned, like most urban dwellers, to keep walking. But something about this woman's profile caught her attention. The slope of her nose, the way she held her shoulders, the particular shade of her hair, even dirty and tangled, sparked a recognition, so visceral that Margaret stopped dead in her tracks. Sarah? The name escaped her lips as barely a whisper. The young woman turned, and their eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself. Margaret saw her daughter's face, thinner than she remembered, marked with exhaustion and something that looked like shame. Register first shock, then horror, then resignation. Sarah's arms tightened protectively around the bundle in her arms, and Margaret noticed for the first time that the bundle was a baby, perhaps 6 months old, with a tiny fist curled against her mother's chest. The grocery bag slipped from Margaret's nerveless fingers. She heard the sound of something breaking, probably the eggs, but she couldn't bring herself to care. All she could see was her daughter, her beautiful, bright daughter, standing before her in clothes that hung loose on her frame, shoes with holes in them, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Please help. Baby needs formula." "Mom!" Sarah's voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. I didn't want you to find out this way." Margaret's feet moved of their own accord, closing the distance between them. Up close, the situation was even worse than she'd thought. Sarah's face was gaunt, her eyes hollow with the kind of exhaustion that spoke of weeks, maybe months, of inadequate sleep and nutrition. The baby in her arms was tiny, too tiny, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days. But the child's eyes were open and alert, watching Margaret with an almost unsettling intelligence. "What happened?" Margaret's voice came out stronger than she felt. "Where's David? Why didn't you call me?" Sarah's laugh was bitter, nothing like the bright sound Margaret remembered from her childhood. "David's gone, Mom. He's been gone for 4 months. And I couldn't call you because—" She paused, her throat working as she struggled with the words. "Because I was too ashamed. Because I didn't want you to know what a mess I'd made of my life." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. 4 months. Her daughter had been struggling, homeless, caring for an infant, for 4 months, and Margaret hadn't known, hadn't sensed it, hadn't been there. "We're going home," Margaret said firmly, reaching for Sarah's arm. "Right now, both of you." But Sarah pulled back, shaking her head. "No, Mom, you don't understand. I can't just... I owe people money. David, before he left, he got involved with some bad people. Gambling debts, Mom. Tens of thousands of dollars. They know who I am. They know about Emma. Her voice broke on the baby's name. If I lead them to you and Dad, if they think you have money, I don't care about any of that right now. Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp with determination. You're standing on a street corner with my granddaughter in November. We're going home, and then we'll figure out the rest. Sarah's resistance crumbled. Her shoulders sagged, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. Margaret pulled both her daughter and granddaughter into her arms, not caring about the looks from passers-by, not caring about the groceries scattered across the sidewalk. She held them both, feeling Sarah's thin frame shake with sobs, feeling the baby squirm between them, and she made a silent vow. Whatever had happened, whatever mistakes had been made, she would fix this. She would save her family. The drive home was mostly silent. Margaret had called Robert from the sidewalk, her voice tight with emotion as she explained, briefly, inadequately, what had happened. His response had been immediate. Bring them home. Now. She loved him fiercely in that moment for not hesitating, for not asking questions that could wait. Sarah sat in the passenger seat holding Emma, staring out the window with an expression that broke Margaret's heart. It was the look of someone who had given up, who had stopped believing in happy endings. The baby, mercifully, had fallen asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. When was the last time you ate? Margaret asked gently. Sarah was quiet for so long that Margaret thought she might not answer. Finally, in a small voice, she said, Yesterday morning. A woman gave me half a sandwich. I gave most of it to Emma. She's starting solid foods now. And formula is so expensive. And I've been trying to make the cans last longer by diluting it more than I should. And I know that's terrible. I know I'm a terrible mother. But I didn't know what else to do. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed while driving. You're not a terrible mother, she said firmly. A terrible mother wouldn't have been out there trying to get food for her baby. A terrible mother would have given up. You didn't give up. I wanted to, Sarah whispered. So many times I wanted to. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Margaret wasn't ready to explore. Not yet. First, they needed to get home. First, they needed safety, food, warmth. The rest could come later. Robert was waiting at the door when they pulled up. Margaret's husband of 32 years, her rock, her partner in everything, stood on their front porch with an expression she'd rarely seen, a mixture of heartbreak and fierce determination. He was down the steps before Margaret had even turned off the car, opening Sarah's door with gentle hands. Sarah Bear, he said, using the nickname he'd given her when she was 3 years old and obsessed with teddy bears. Let's get you inside. Sarah broke down again at the sound of her childhood nickname, and Robert enveloped both her and Emma in his arms, murmuring the same soothing words he'd used when she was small and had scraped her knee or lost a spelling bee. Margaret watched them through misty eyes, grateful beyond words for this man who knew instinctively what their daughter needed. Inside, the house was warm and filled with the scent of the soup Robert had started on the stove. Chicken noodle, Sarah's childhood favorite. He must have started cooking the moment he'd hung up the phone with Margaret. The gesture was so characteristic of him, so perfectly Robert, that Margaret had to blink back fresh tears. They settled Sarah on the couch, and Margaret took Emma, holding her granddaughter for the first time. The baby was lighter than she should be, her eyes too large in her small face. But she was alert, and, after a moment's hesitation, gave Margaret a gummy smile that went straight to her heart. She's beautiful, Margaret whispered. She has your eyes, Sarah, and I think she has Dad's chin. Sarah's laugh was watery but genuine. She does. She looks just like my baby pictures. I kept thinking about how you used to show me those pictures and tell me stories about when I was little. And now I have my own baby. And I wanted to make you proud. Wanted to be the kind of mother you were to me, and instead, her voice trailed off into a sob. Instead, you did everything you could to protect your daughter. Margaret finished firmly. You survived impossible circumstances. That's not failure, Sarah. That's heroism. Robert returned from the kitchen with bowls of soup, crackers, and a warmed bottle of formula he'd somehow procured. I called Mary Beth next door, he explained, seeing Margaret's questioning look. She's got grandkids. She brought this over along with some diapers and baby food. Said to tell Sarah welcome home. The simple kindness of their neighbor, the matter-of-fact way Robert had mobilized help, the warmth of the house, it all became too much for Sarah. She ate her soup through tears, each spoonful seeming to release another wave of emotion. Margaret fed Emma her bottle, marveling at how eagerly the baby drank, how she clutched at the bottle with her tiny hands as if afraid it might be taken away. As the evening wore on, the immediate crisis began to ease. Sarah had 2 bowls of soup, a shower that lasted nearly 40 minutes, and was now dressed in Margaret's pajamas, which hung loosely on her thin frame. Emma had been bathed in the kitchen sink, fed until she couldn't eat another bite, and was now sleeping peacefully in a makeshift bed. Robert had created using dresser drawers and soft blankets. It was time for the conversation none of them wanted to have, but all of them needed. They sat in the living room, the same room where they'd celebrated Sarah's high school graduation, where she'd opened her college acceptance letters, where she'd introduced them to David for the first time. That last memory felt particularly bitter now. "Tell us everything," Margaret said gently. "From the beginning." Sarah took a shaky breath. "David lost his job about 18 months ago. He was an investment analyst at Morrison & Clark. There were layoffs, and he took it really hard. He'd defined himself by that job, by the money he made, by the lifestyle we had. When it was gone, he didn't know who he was anymore." She paused, twisting her hands in her lap. "I was pregnant with Emma by then, about 4 months along. I told him it would be okay, that we had savings, that I could pick up extra freelance work, that we'd figure it out together. But he started going out more, coming home late. He said he was networking, trying to find leads on jobs, meeting with former colleagues. I believed him." Margaret reached over and took her daughter's hand. "What was he really doing?" "Gambling." The word came out flat, emotionless. Online poker at first, then in-person games with people he'd met through some of his former co-workers. High-stakes games. He told me he was going to win back what we'd lost, rebuild our nest egg before Emma was born. He was so convinced he could control it, that he had a system, that he was smarter than everyone else. "But he wasn't," Robert said quietly. Sarah shook her head. "No, he wasn't. By the time Emma was born, we'd gone through all our savings. David kept saying he just needed one big win, one good night, and everything would be fine. I wanted to believe him. I was exhausted from taking care of a newborn, and he seemed so confident, and I let myself believe." Her voice hardened slightly. "Then people started showing up at our apartment, men who said David owed them money. A lot of money. At first, they were almost polite, just asking when they could expect payment. But David kept gambling, kept losing, trying to win back what he owed plus what he'd lost. The visits got less friendly. One night, someone broke our living room window, left a note that said we had 2 weeks to come up with $20,000, or there would be consequences. Margaret felt sick. "Sarah, why didn't you call us? We would have helped." I know that now. But David made me promise not to tell you. He was so ashamed. Mom? He couldn't stand the thought of you and Dad knowing what he'd done, what he'd brought on us. He kept saying he'd fix it, that he had a plan. And I was scared too. Scared of admitting how bad things had gotten. Scared of disappointing you. You could never disappoint us, Robert said firmly. Never. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. But I did. I made so many wrong choices. I should have left him when the gambling started. I should have called you the first time someone threatened us. I should have protected Emma better. What happened next? Margaret prompted gently. David left. 4 months ago, I woke up one morning, and he was gone. No note, no explanation, nothing. Just gone. He cleaned out what little money we had left in our checking account, about $300. I tried calling him, texting, emailing. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished. Sarah's voice became almost mechanical, as if she were recounting events that had happened to someone else. 2 days later, 3 men came to the apartment. They said David owed them $47,000. When I told them he was gone, that I didn't know where he was, they laughed. Said the debt didn't disappear just because he did. That as his wife, I was responsible for it. 2. They gave me 2 weeks to come up with at least $10,000, or they'd start taking payment in other ways. Margaret's blood ran cold. Sarah, what does that mean? Did they hurt you? No, not physically. But they made it very clear what could happen if I didn't pay. And they mentioned Emma. Said what a pretty baby she was. How vulnerable babies are. Sarah's voice broke. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't risk them coming back and taking her or hurting her to get to David or to me. So I took Emma and whatever I could carry in 2 duffel bags, and I left. Where have you been staying? Robert asked. Everywhere, nowhere, shelters when we could get a spot, which wasn't often because they're always full. The bus station some nights, under bridges, in parks. I tried to keep Emma dry and warm and fed. But it's so hard, Dad. Everything costs money, and I couldn't get a job because I had nowhere to leave Emma and no address for paperwork and no way to clean up properly for an interview. I sold everything I could, my laptop, my phone, my wedding ring, but it was never enough. She looked at her parents with devastated eyes. I've been begging on that corner for 3 weeks. It's one of the better spots because there's a coffee shop nearby and people coming out with their expensive lattes sometimes have guilt money to spare. On a good day, I could make $30 or $40, enough for formula and diapers and maybe something for me to eat. On bad days, nothing. The room fell silent except for the sound of Emma's soft breathing from her makeshift bed. Margaret looked at her daughter, her brave, stubborn, foolish daughter who had endured horrors, trying to protect her baby, and felt a complex mixture of emotions, so intense she could barely breathe. Anger at David for his weakness and his cruelty in abandoning them. Fury at the men who had preyed on Sarah's vulnerability. Heartbreak at what her daughter had suffered. And underneath it all, a blazing determination to make everything right. You're safe now, Margaret said firmly. Both of you. You're safe and you're home, and no one is going to hurt you here. But the money, Sarah started. I don't care about the money, Margaret interrupted. We'll figure it out. We'll talk to lawyers, to the police, to whoever we need to talk to. David's debts are not your responsibility, and no court in the land would say they are. Those men have no legal claim on you. They don't care about legal, Sarah said tiredly. That's the point. Robert leaned forward, his expression serious. Then we'll make them care. First thing Monday morning, we're going to the police. We're going to document everything, the threats, the intimidation, all of it. We're going to get a restraining order if we can, and we're going to make it very clear that you have family, resources, and the willingness to use every legal tool available to protect you. And in the meantime, Margaret added, you're going to rest. You're going to eat. You're going to let Emma be a baby without worrying about where her next meal is coming from. You're going to remember what it feels like to be safe. Sarah looked between her parents, and something in her expression shifted. The resignation began to crack, allowing something else to show through, something fragile and tentative that might have been hope. I don't deserve this, she whispered. I don't deserve your help after shutting you out for so long. That's the thing about family, Robert said gently. Deserving doesn't enter into it. You're our daughter. Emma is our granddaughter. That's all that matters. That night, Sarah slept in her childhood bedroom with Emma beside her in the drawer bed. Margaret checked on them several times, unable to resist the pull to make sure they were really there, really safe. Each time she found them the same way. Sarah curled protectively around her daughter, even in sleep, maintaining the vigilance that had kept them alive on the streets. In their own bedroom, Margaret and Robert held each other in the dark. I can't believe she's been out there for 4 months, Margaret whispered. 4 months, Robert. While we were going about our normal lives, having dinner, watching television, sleeping in our warm bed. Our daughter was homeless with a baby. We didn't know, Robert reminded her gently. We couldn't have known. She made sure of that. But I'm her mother. Shouldn't I have sensed something? Shouldn't there have been some instinct that told me she was in trouble? Robert was quiet for a moment. Maybe. Or maybe Sarah is very good at hiding when she's hurting, just like her mother. Margaret knew he was referring to the year after her own mother's death, when she had maintained a perfect facade of competence while falling apart inside. She had fooled everyone except Robert, who had gently, persistently, loved her back to wholeness. We have her back now, Robert continued. That's what matters. Now we make sure she knows she's not alone, that she never has to be alone again. They lay in the darkness, planning and worrying and loving, until sleep finally claimed them. The next morning brought new challenges. Emma woke at dawn, hungry and needing a diaper change. Margaret heard Sarah moving around and got up to help, finding her daughter in the kitchen, looking lost and uncertain. I didn't want to wake you, Sarah said apologetically. I was trying to figure out how to make a bottle without disturbing anyone. Sarah, Margaret said firmly, this is your home. You don't need to tiptoe around. You don't need permission to feed your daughter. This is where you belong. Over the next few days, they established new routines. Robert took time off work, and together he and Margaret helped Sarah begin the long process of rebuilding her life. They went to the police station, where a sympathetic detective listened to Sarah's story and began an investigation into the men who had threatened her. They visited a legal aid clinic, where a lawyer explained Sarah's rights and options regarding David's debts. The news was mostly good. As the lawyer explained, gambling debts held by illegal operators had no legal standing. Sarah couldn't be forced to pay them, and the threats constituted criminal harassment. The detective assured them that organized gambling rings preyed on fear and isolation. When confronted with victims who had resources and were willing to fight back, they typically moved on to easier targets. But the emotional recovery was slower and more complex than the legal maneuvering. Sarah was jumpy at loud noises, panicked if Emma cried for more than a few seconds, and struggled with crippling guilt over the months Emma had spent in unstable, inadequate conditions. She deserved better, Sarah said one afternoon, watching Emma play with a new toy on a blanket in the living room. Margaret had taken her shopping for baby supplies, and the house was now well-stocked with everything a 6-month-old could need. She deserved a mother who could provide for her, who didn't have to choose between feeding her and feeding myself. She had exactly the mother she deserved, Margaret said firmly. A mother who protected her, who sacrificed for her, who never gave up, even when giving up would have been easier. Do you think she'll remember those hard months, Sarah? She won't. But she'll grow up, knowing that she had a mother who loved her, enough to endure anything for her. That's the legacy you've given her. Sarah's therapist, Margaret, had insisted on finding one and was paying for the sessions, said similar things. She talked about post-traumatic stress, about the strength it took to survive what Sarah had survived, about the importance of self-forgiveness. Progress was slow, but it was there. Emma, meanwhile, thrived. With regular meals and a safe, warm place to sleep, she began gaining weight and hitting developmental milestones. Her laugh became a regular sound in the house, and Margaret discovered the particular joy of grandmotherhood. Robert was equally smitten, spending hours playing peekaboo and reading board books with exaggerated enthusiasm. Watching Robert with Emma, Sarah said to Margaret one evening, I forgot what it was like to not be scared all the time, to trust that tomorrow will come and we'll be okay. You and Dad gave that back to me, but peace is always fragile, and theirs was shattered on a Wednesday afternoon 6 weeks after Sarah had come home. Margaret was at work when her cell phone rang. Sarah's name on the caller ID made her heart clench. They'd agreed. Sarah would only call during work hours if it was an emergency. Mom! Sarah's voice was tight with fear. Someone's watching the house. Margaret's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Where's Emma? She's with me. We're locked in the bathroom. Mom, there's a man parked across the street. He's been there for an hour, just sitting in his car, watching. I think, I think, they found me. Call 911 right now, Margaret said, already grabbing her purse and heading for the door. I'm calling Dad, and we're both coming home. Do not open the door for anyone. Do you understand? Not for anyone. The drive home was a blur of fear and determination. Robert called to say he was already on his way, having left a meeting the moment he got Margaret's text. The police arrived first, 2 officers who took Sarah's statement and went to talk to the man in the car. By the time Margaret and Robert arrived, the situation had evolved. The man in the car wasn't one of the men who had threatened Sarah. He was a private investigator hired by David's parents. They didn't know, the investigator explained to the assembled group in the living room, about Emma, about what David had done, about any of it. When David disappeared, they hired me to find him. I tracked him to Las Vegas, where he's apparently been living under an assumed name, working as a dealer at a casino. When I reported back to his parents, they wanted to know about his wife and asked me to locate her. They had no idea there was a baby. Margaret looked at the investigator with skepticism. And you thought parking outside our house for an hour was a good way to gather information? He had the grace to look embarrassed. I was trying to confirm this was the right address before approaching. I apologize for frightening anyone. That wasn't my intent. Sarah, pale but composed, spoke up. What do David's parents want? To help, the investigator said. If you're willing to speak with them, they're devastated by what their son has done. They want to make amends if they can. The conversation that followed was long and complex. Sarah was understandably wary. These were David's parents, after all, and David had abandoned her and Emma without a second thought. But Margaret, listening to the investigator's account of their reaction to learning about Emma, their distress at what had happened, found herself inclined toward cautious optimism. You don't have to decide now, she told Sarah. You don't owe them anything. But if they're sincere about wanting to help, about wanting to be part of Emma's life, that could be good for her. Every child deserves as many people loving them as possible. Sarah agreed to think about it, and the investigator left his card with instructions that David's parents would appreciate a call when and if Sarah felt ready. That evening, after Emma was asleep and the adrenaline had worn off, Sarah broke down. I can't do this, Mom, she sobbed. I can't keep looking over my shoulder, wondering if every car is someone coming for us, if every knock on the door is a threat. I thought we were safe here, but we're not. We'll never be safe as long as those debts exist, as long as David's out there making more mistakes and more enemies. Margaret held her daughter, letting her cry, knowing that sometimes tears are the only release for fear that has no outlet. When the storm had passed, she said quietly, Then we take away their power. We do it by refusing to hide, by refusing to let fear dictate our lives. And we do it by you building something new, AD. Life so full and so strong that David's shadows can't touch it. How? Sarah asked. One day at a time, Margaret replied. One choice at a time, starting with whether you want to meet David's parents. After 3 days of deliberation and a long conversation with her therapist, Sarah agreed to a meeting. Margaret and Robert insisted on being present, and it was arranged for a neutral location, a family counselor's office that the investigator's clients had offered to pay for. David's parents, Judith and Harold Chen, were in their late 50s, well-dressed and clearly prosperous. They also looked gutted. When they saw Emma for the first time, Judith had asked if Sarah would bring the oid baby. Judith began crying. She's beautiful, she whispered. She looks just like David did as a baby. Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what our son did to you. What followed was a conversation unlike any Margaret had witnessed. David's parents were genuinely horrified by what had happened. They'd known David had lost his job, but not about the gambling, the debts, or the threats. They certainly hadn't known about Emma's existence. We failed him, Harold said heavily. We raised him to value success above everything else. We pushed him so hard to achieve, to excel, to make money. When he called us to say he'd lost his job, we said things we shouldn't have, about disappointment, about not living up to his potential. We never told him it was okay to fail, that we'd love him anyway. I think that's part of why he spiraled the way he did. That doesn't excuse what he did, Margaret said firmly. Nothing excuses abandoning his wife and infant daughter. No, Judith agreed. Nothing excuses that, but we'd like to help, if you'll let us. We can't change what David did, but we can make sure our granddaughter has everything she needs. The conversation turned to practical matters. David's parents offered financial support, which Sarah initially refused until the counselor gently pointed out that accepting help didn't mean condoning David's actions. It meant ensuring Emma had resources and opportunities. They also shared what they'd learned about David. He was in Las Vegas, working at a casino, apparently clean from gambling, but also making no effort to contact his wife or daughter. The investigator had spoken with him, and David's response had been cowardly. He said he was too ashamed to face what he'd done, that Sarah and Emma were better off without him, that he had nothing to offer them. So he's still running away, Sarah said bitterly. Still taking the easy way out. Yes, Judith said quietly. And we're ashamed of that too. But Sarah, you and Emma don't have to keep paying for his cowardice. You deserve to move forward, to build a life. Over the following months, an unlikely relationship developed between Sarah and David's parents. They visited regularly, always respectful of Sarah's boundaries, always focused on Emma, rather than making excuses for their son. They set up an education fund for Emma, helped Sarah find an apartment she could afford. They co-signed the lease when her credit proved problematic, and provided the kind of grandparental support that Emma deserved. Margaret watched this development with mixed feelings. She was glad Sarah had more support, glad Emma had more family in her life. But she also felt a possessiveness she wasn't proud of. These people got to swoop in and play the heroes, while she and Robert had done the hard work of piecing Sarah back together. Robert, perceptive as always, addressed it one night. "You're not losing her," he said gently. "She's not replacing us. She's just building a larger circle of support, which is exactly what she needs." "I know," Margaret sighed. "Intellectually, I know that. But emotionally, you want to be the only one who saves her, who she needs, who she relies on," Robert finished. "Because you love her, and you feel guilty about the months when you didn't know she needed saving." Margaret looked at her husband with tears in her eyes. "How do you always know what I'm feeling?" 32 years of practice, he said, pulling her close. "And because I love you, which means I pay attention." Sarah, meanwhile, was making real progress. She'd started taking online classes to finish her degree, which had been interrupted by Emma's birth and the subsequent disasters. She'd found a part-time job at a local nonprofit that allowed her to bring Emma to work. She joined a support group for people recovering from financial abuse and trauma. She was, slowly but surely, rebuilding. One Saturday afternoon, 8 months after that day on the street corner, Sarah asked Margaret to go for a walk. They pushed Emma in her stroller through the park near Margaret's house, watching children play on swings and families have picnics on the grass. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said. "I've been working with my therapist on this, trying to figure out how to say it." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. "Okay, I need you to know that I don't blame you for not finding me sooner," Sarah said. "I know you feel guilty about the months I was on the street, and I know you think you should have somehow sensed I was in trouble. But Mom, I worked really hard to make sure you wouldn't know. I didn't call, I didn't email. I made sure I was in a part of the city where I was unlikely to run into anyone we knew. You not knowing wasn't a failure on your part. It was a success on mine, because I was that determined to hide what was happening." "But why?" Margaret asked. "Why work so hard to hide from the people who love you?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Because I was ashamed. Because admitting what was happening felt like admitting I'd failed at everything. Failed at choosing a good partner, failed at managing our finances, failed at protecting my baby. And because," she paused, her voice breaking slightly, "because you and Dad always seemed to have it all figured out. You had the perfect marriage, the successful careers. You never seemed to struggle or make mistakes. I thought if I told you how badly I'd screwed up my life, you'd be disappointed in me, and I couldn't bear that. Margaret stopped walking, turning to face her daughter. Sarah, your father and I have made countless mistakes. Our marriage has been hard sometimes. I almost left him during the first year. Did you know that? We fought constantly about money and in-laws and whose career should take priority. My business nearly went bankrupt in the 2008 recession. I've struggled with depression and anxiety for years. From the outside, it might have looked perfect. But that's because we chose not to burden you with adult problems when you were young. Sarah stared at her. You almost left Dad. Almost. We went to counseling, worked through our issues, and came out stronger. But my point is, Sarah, everyone struggles. Everyone makes mistakes. The appearance of perfection is just that, an appearance. And you could never disappoint us. Not by needing help, not by making mistakes, not by being human. They walked in silence for a while, processing. Finally, Sarah spoke again. There's something else I need to say. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me that day on the street corner. Thank you for insisting I come home even when I tried to refuse. Thank you for giving Emma a safe place to grow up. Thank you for loving us when I couldn't figure out how to love myself. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. You don't need to thank me for that. You're my daughter. There is nothing I wouldn't do for you. I know that now, Sarah said. But I didn't know it then. I'd spent so long feeling alone that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone in my corner, someone who would fight for me no matter what. You reminded me. You and Dad both reminded me that I was worth fighting for. They hugged there in the park, Emma watching them with curious eyes, and Margaret felt something shift. The guilt that had been weighing on her, the constant what-ifs and if-onlys, began to ease. Not disappear entirely, but ease enough that she could breathe around it. As Emma approached her first birthday, the family had grown and changed in ways none of them could have predicted that day on. The street corner. Sarah had her own apartment now, a small but sunny two-bedroom that she'd decorated with care. Emma had her own room there, painted a cheerful yellow with clouds on the ceiling that Robert had painstakingly stenciled. Sarah still came to Margaret and Robert's house several times a week for dinner, and Margaret still had a nursery set up in their guest room for overnight visits. But Sarah had her independence back, carefully, gradually, on her own terms. David's parents had become regular fixtures in Emma's life. Judith picked her up for grandma days once a week, taking her to music classes and the children's museum. Harold had built Emma a custom bookshelf for her room and filled it with classics and new releases alike. They never pushed to see Sarah more than she was comfortable with, never tried to force a relationship beyond their shared love for Emma. It was, Margaret had to admit, a healthy arrangement. David himself remained in Las Vegas. Sarah had finally spoken to him once, through a video call arranged by his parents. It had been stilted and painful, with David offering apologies that felt hollow and Sarah responding with a coldness that Margaret had never heard from her daughter. Before, he'd asked to see Emma and Sarah had refused, telling him that he'd have to earn that right through consistent action, not empty words. The call had ended with David in tears and Sarah unmoved. I thought I'd feel something, Sarah had told Margaret afterward. Anger, sadness, something. But I just felt empty. Like I was talking to a stranger. Maybe because he is a stranger now. The man I married wouldn't have done what he did. Or maybe the man I married never existed in the first place, and I just couldn't see it. The therapist said this emotional distance was actually progress, a sign that Sarah had processed her grief and anger, and was ready to move forward without being weighed down by what David had done. Margaret hoped that was true. Emma's first birthday party was a celebration in more ways than one. Margaret and Robert hosted it at their house, and the guest list reflected the new shape of their family. Judith and Harold, Sarah's support group, friends, neighbors, colleagues from Sarah's nonprofit job, and the detective who'd helped with their case and had become an unexpected friend. Watching Emma dive face first into her birthday cake, hearing her delighted shrieks as she was passed from lap to lap, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude. This child, who had spent her first months in such precarious circumstances, was now surrounded by love and security. And Sarah, who had stood on a street corner with a cardboard sign, was now glowing with confidence as she chatted with guests and wiped frosting from her
after the
daughter's
guests
face.
had
Left and Sarah was loading presents into her car, Robert came to stand beside Margaret on the porch. "Quite a year," he said quietly. "Quite a year," Margaret agreed. "Do you think about that day?" Robert asked. "The day you found them?" "Every day," Margaret admitted. "Sometimes I still have nightmares about it, about walking past, about not recognizing her, about all the ways it could have gone wrong." "But it didn't go wrong," Robert reminded her. "You found her. You brought her home. You saved them both." "We saved them," Margaret corrected. "And they saved themselves too, really." Sarah's strength through all of this. "I don't know if I could have endured what she endured." Robert was quiet for a moment. "You know what strikes me most about this whole thing? How much closer it's brought all of us. Not just physically, but emotionally. We know each other better now. We trust each other more deeply. It's like the crisis stripped away all the pretense, all the walls we'd built without even realizing it, and left us with just the raw truth of how much we love each other." Margaret leaned into her husband, watching Sarah buckle Emma into her car seat with practiced ease. "You're right. I know things about Sarah now that I might never have known otherwise. About her fears, her strengths, her capacity for endurance. And she knows things about us. That we're not perfect. That we've struggled too. That our love for her is unconditional in ways she'd never tested before." Sarah finished loading the car and came back up the porch steps. "Thank you for today," she said, hugging them both. "Thank you for making Emma's first birthday so special. Thank you for—" She paused, searching for words. "Thank you for being the kind of parents who make a person want to be a better parent themselves." After Sarah and Emma drove away, Margaret and Robert cleaned up the party debris in comfortable silence. As she was washing cake plates, Margaret's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something made her answer. "Mrs. Thompson? This is Detective Harrison. I wanted to update you on the case involving the men who threatened your daughter." Margaret's heart rate picked up. "Yes? We've made arrests. All 3 of the men your daughter identified have been charged with criminal harassment, extortion, and illegal gambling operations. The evidence you and Sarah provided was instrumental. I thought you'd want to know." After she hung up, Margaret sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Robert appeared in the doorway, dish towel in hand. "What is it?" "They arrested the men who threatened Sarah. Detective Harrison says they're facing serious charges." Robert came to sit beside her, taking her hand. "It's really over then?" "The legal part is," Margaret said. "But Sarah, she's already moved past this. She's already built a new life. I don't think she needs this closure the way I thought she would." "Maybe the closure is for you then," Robert suggested. "Maybe you needed to know that those men would face consequences, that justice exists even when the world feels unjust." Margaret realized he was right. The arrests didn't change Sarah's past or Emma's difficult first months, but they provided a sense of completion, of the scales being balanced in some small way. The following months brought new developments. Sarah finished her degree, graduating with honors in a small ceremony that the whole family attended. She got a promotion at the nonprofit, taking on more responsibility and a better salary. Emma took her first steps, spoke her first words. The first was, "Mama," and Sarah cried, and developed a personality that was equal parts sweet and stubborn. David remained in Las Vegas, a ghost haunting the edges of their lives but no longer central to the story. He sent child support payments now. His parents had apparently made it clear that was non-negotiable but otherwise maintained his distance. Sarah had started divorce proceedings, working with a lawyer who specialized in cases involving financial abuse. It was a slow process, but Sarah approached it with the same methodical determination she applied to everything else in her new life. One evening in spring, almost 18 months after that day on the street corner, Sarah asked Margaret to meet her for coffee. They sat in a cafe near Margaret's office, watching people hurry past on their way home from work. "I've been thinking about writing down what happened," Sarah said. "Not for publication or anything like that, but just documenting it. So Emma will know someday where she came from and what we survived. I think that's a wonderful idea, Margaret said. Though it might be hard, reliving it all. Maybe, Sarah agreed, but my therapist thinks it could be healing too. A way of taking ownership of the narrative, of defining the story on my own terms rather than letting it define me. She paused, stirring her coffee absently. I want Emma to know that bad things happened, but we survived them. That we had people who loved us and helped us. That her grandmother saw us on a street corner and didn't just walk by, didn't just give us spare change and feel good about herself. She stopped. She really stopped and saw us and brought us home. Margaret felt tears prickling her eyes. I almost didn't recognize you, she admitted. If I'd been more distracted, if I'd been looking at my phone or thinking too hard about something else, I might have walked right past. But you didn't, Sarah said firmly. That's what matters. In the infinite possible versions of that day, in all the ways it could have gone, you saw me. You recognized me. You saved me. I recognized you because I'm your mother, Margaret said. Because I've loved you since before you were born. Because I know the slope of your nose and the set of your shoulders and the particular way you hold your head. I would have recognized you anywhere, in any circumstance. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling around them like a blanket. There's something else, Sarah said. I've been offered a position at a larger nonprofit. Better pay, better benefits, opportunities for advancement. It's in Seattle. Margaret felt her heart drop. Seattle? That's 3,000 miles away. I know, Sarah said. And I haven't accepted yet because I wanted to talk to you first. But Mom, it's an incredible opportunity. It's the kind of job I dreamed about before everything fell apart. And Seattle has great schools, affordable housing, a good community. It could be a fresh start for Emma and me. Margaret struggled to keep her voice steady. What about David's parents? They've become such a big part of Emma's life. We've talked about it. They're supportive, actually. They said Emma's well-being and my career have to come first, and they'll visit as often as we want them to. They're even talking about buying a small place in Seattle so they have somewhere to stay when they come. And what do you want? Margaret asked. Not what's practical or smart or good for your career. What do you want? Sarah looked at her mother with eyes that were clearer and stronger than they'd been in years. I want to prove to myself that I can do it. That I can move to a new city and build a life and raise my daughter and succeed at my career. Not because I'm running away from the past. I've done enough running, but because I'm running towards something. A future I'm creating on purpose, with intention. Margaret took a deep breath, forcing down the selfish part of her that wanted to beg Sarah to stay close, to keep Emma within easy visiting distance, to not disrupt the family unit they'd rebuilt so carefully. Then you should take it, she said. You should absolutely take it. Really? Sarah looked surprised, as if she'd been expecting an argument. Really, Margaret confirmed. Sarah, you've spent the last 18 months rebuilding yourself, rediscovering your strength, learning to trust your own judgment again. This job, this move, it's the next step in that journey. I won't pretend I'm not sad about you being so far away, or that I won't miss seeing Emma grow up on a daily basis. But your happiness, your growth, your success, those matter more than my convenience? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I was so scared you'd be upset, or disappointed, or that you'd think I was ungrateful for everything you've done. How could you ever be ungrateful? Margaret asked. Sarah, you say I saved you, but you don't see how much you saved me too. Before you came back into our lives, I'd gotten comfortable, complacent. I'd forgotten what it meant to fight for something, to sacrifice for someone. You reminded me what matters. You reminded me what love actually requires. Not just the easy, comfortable kind, but the hard, transformative kind that changes everyone involved. They hugged across the table, coffee cups pushed aside, both crying now but with smiles on their faces. The next few months were a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah accepted the job, gave notice at her current position, and began the process of moving across the country. Margaret helped her pack, sorting through belongings and memories. deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. One afternoon, as they were boxing up Emma's room, Sarah held up a worn blanket, the one she'd been using to wrap. Emma in that day on the street corner. "I should throw this away," she said. "It's got holes in it. It's seen better days." "But?" Margaret prompted, seeing the hesitation. "But it's the blanket that kept Emma warm on the coldest nights. It's the blanket I held when I thought I couldn't go on. It's—" She struggled for words. "It's a witness to the worst time in my life, but also to how we survived it." "Then keep it," Margaret said firmly. "Not for Emma necessarily, but for you, as a reminder that you're stronger than you ever imagined you could be." Sarah carefully folded the blanket and placed it in a box marked "Keep Important." The day Sarah and Emma left for Seattle was one of the hardest of Margaret's life. She and Robert drove them to the airport, and Margaret held Emma for as long as she could, memorizing the weight of her granddaughter in her arms, the smell of her baby shampoo, the sound of her giggle. "We'll video chat every day," Sarah promised, "and you can visit whenever you want. And we'll come back for holidays." "This isn't goodbye forever, Mom. It's just goodbye for now." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched Sarah walk through security with Emma on her hip, both of them turning to wave one last time before disappearing around a corner. In the car, Robert reached over and took her hand. "She's going to be amazing," he said. "I know," Margaret replied. "That's not what I'm worried about." "What are you worried about?" Margaret thought about it. "I'm not worried exactly. I'm just sad. Sad that the everyday moments are over. The spontaneous dinners, the Sunday morning pancakes, the bedtime stories I could read to Emma whenever I wanted. Those felt like a gift after almost losing them. And now the gift is changing shape." "Not ending," Robert pointed out. "Just changing shape. That's what families do. They evolve, they adapt, they find new ways to love each other across distances." He was right, of course. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Margaret discovered new rhythms. Daily video calls with Emma, who was thriving in Seattle, and had started calling Margaret Gamma in her toddler voice. Long phone conversations with Sarah about work challenges and parenting victories, and the ordinary details of daily life. Packages sent back and forth filled with books and toys and photos. Planned visits that everyone looked forward to. Sarah sent updates regularly. Photos of Emma at the park, videos of her singing along to children's songs, stories about her job and the people she was meeting. From all accounts, Sarah was flourishing. She'd made friends, joined a community group for single mothers, even started dating someone, though she was taking it very slowly, learning to trust her judgment in relationships again. "I'm not the same person who married David," she told Margaret during one of their calls. "I'm not even the same person who stood on that street corner with a cardboard sign. I'm someone new, someone I've built deliberately from the pieces of who I used to be, and the strength I discovered I had. And I actually like who I'm becoming." Margaret heard the confidence in her daughter's voice and felt proud beyond measure. 2 years after that day on the street corner, Margaret and Robert flew to Seattle for Emma's 3rd birthday. Sarah picked them up from the airport, and Margaret was struck by how different her daughter looked. Not in appearance, but in bearing. She stood straighter, smiled more easily, moved through the world with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Emma, now a chatty, energetic 3-year-old, threw herself into Margaret's arms. "Gamma! Grandpa! You here? You here for my birthday?" Sarah's apartment was lovely, small but well decorated, full of light and laughter and signs of a life being lived fully. Photos covered the walls. Emma at various ages, Sarah at work events, Sarah and Emma with new friends, Sarah's graduation photo, and, Margaret noticed with a catch in her throat, a photo of the whole family at last year's Thanksgiving, the first one they'd spent together after Sarah moved. The birthday party was at a local park, attended by Sarah's colleagues, Emma's friends from daycare, and the small community Sarah had built in Seattle. Margaret watched her daughter move through the crowd, laughing and talking, completely at ease, and realized that Sarah had done exactly what she'd set out to do. She'd created a new life, one defined not by what she'd lost, but by what she'd built. That evening, after Emma was asleep and Robert had retired to the guest room, Sarah and Margaret sat on the small balcony of the apartment, looking out at the Seattle skyline. "I never thanked you properly," Sarah said quietly. "For that day, for seeing me when I'd tried so hard to be invisible." "You've thanked me 100 times," Margaret protested. "Not for what I really mean," Sarah said. "I thanked you for taking me in, for feeding us, for giving us a place to stay. But I never thanked you for the other thing, for not treating me like I was broken, for being disappointed in my circumstances but never in me, for giving me space to be angry and sad and scared, without trying to fix it all immediately, for letting me rebuild myself, rather than trying to rebuild me according to your vision of who I should be." Margaret felt tears welling up. "Is that what I did?" "It's exactly what you did," Sarah said. "You provided safety and support, but you let me decide what came next. You offered advice when I asked for it, and stayed quiet when I didn't. You loved me through the mess without trying to clean up the mess faster than I was ready for. Do you know how rare that is? How hard it must have been to watch me struggle and not just swoop in and take over." "It was one of the hardest things I've ever done," Margaret admitted. "Every instinct I had was screaming at me to fix everything, to make all the problems disappear, to shield you from any more pain. But you're right. That would have been about my needs, not yours. You needed to discover your own strength, make your own choices, build your own life. I just had to trust that you could do it." "And I did," Sarah said with quiet pride. "I really did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance. "Can I tell you something?" Sarah asked. "I'm thinking about going back to school, getting my master's in social work. I want to work specifically with women in situations like mine. Women escaping financial abuse. Women trying to raise children in impossible circumstances. Women who feel like they have nowhere to turn." "Sarah, that's wonderful," Margaret said. "You'd be incredible at that." "I think I would," Sarah agreed, "because I've been there. I know what it feels like to be at rock bottom. I know what it takes to climb back up. And I know what kind of help actually helps, versus what kind of help just makes you feel small and incapable." "When would you start?" "Next fall, if I get accepted. It's a 2-year program, part-time, so I can keep working. Emma will be in preschool by then, which helps, and—" She hesitated. "There's someone I've been seeing. Jake. He's a teacher, very steady, very kind. Nothing like David. I'm not rushing into anything, but he's good with Emma, and he understands about my past. I think I might be ready to trust again. Carefully, slowly, but ready." Margaret reached over and took her daughter's hand. "I'm so happy for you. For all of it. The school, the career plans, the possibility of love. You deserve every good thing that comes your way." "I'm starting to believe that," Sarah said. "For a long time, I thought I deserved the bad things that happened, because I'd made such poor choices. But my therapist helped me understand that David's choices were his, not mine. The gambling, the debts, the abandonment, none of that was my fault. And the fact that I survived, that Emma and I made it through, that wasn't luck. That was strength and resilience, and the refusal to give up, even when giving up, would have been so much easier. And love," Margaret added. "Don't forget love. The love you have for Emma, the love we have for you, the love that kept you fighting when you wanted to quit." "Love," Sarah repeated softly. "Yes, that most of all." The weekend passed too quickly. Margaret and Robert took Emma to the zoo, helped Sarah with some apartment repairs, had long dinners filled with laughter and stories. When it was time to leave, the goodbye was easier than it had been. The first time, not because Margaret missed them any less, but because she could see how well they were doing, how full and rich Sarah's life had become. On the plane ride home, Robert said, "She's really going to be okay, isn't she? More than okay. She's going to thrive." "She already is thriving," Margaret replied. "And so is Emma. They both are." "Does it bother you?" Robert asked. "That she doesn't need us the way she did?" Margaret thought about it. "No," she said finally. "That's exactly what I wanted. for her to heal enough that she could stand on her own, make her own choices, build her own life. The fact that she doesn't need us to survive doesn't mean she doesn't want us in her life. That's actually better. Now, when we see each other, when we talk, it's because we choose to, because we want to share our lives with each other, not because anyone's dependent or desperate. That's a very healthy perspective, Robert observed. I've had a good therapist too, Margaret admitted. It took me a while to work through my own feelings about everything that happened. The guilt, the fear, the need to control outcomes. But I'm getting there. Learning to trust that Sarah is capable of running her own life, making her own mistakes, finding her own solutions, and learning that you don't have to be perfect to be a good mother. Robert added gently, that you didn't fail Sarah by not somehow sensing she was in trouble. That love doesn't come with psychic powers, unfortunately. Margaret smiled. That too. 5 years after that day on the street corner, Sarah completed her master's degree. Margaret and Robert flew to Seattle for the graduation, bringing with them David's parents, who had remained fixtures in Emma's life despite the distance. Whatever lingering tension had existed between Margaret and Judith had long since evaporated, replaced by a mutual respect and shared love for Emma. At 7 years old, Emma was bright, curious, and remarkably well-adjusted considering her rocky start in life. She had friends, hobbies, opinions on everything, and absolutely no memory of those difficult first months. Sometimes Margaret wondered if she should be glad about that or sad. Glad that Emma had been too young to remember the trauma, or sad that she'd never know just how much her mother had sacrificed for her. She'll know, Sarah had assured her once. Maybe not the specific memories, but she'll know in the way that matters. Through the bond we have, through the security she feels, through the knowledge that she's loved completely and unconditionally. That's the legacy of those months. Mom, not the fear and hunger, but the love that got us through it. At the graduation ceremony, Margaret watched Sarah walk across the stage to receive her master's degree in social work. The crowd applauded, but Margaret's eyes were fixed on her daughter's face, radiant with pride and accomplishment, marked by the wisdom that comes from surviving hard things. After the ceremony, they gathered for photos. Sarah and Emma, Sarah with her diploma, the whole family together. Sarah with Jake, who had proposed 3 months earlier and was now Sarah's fiancé. In every photo, Sarah was smiling, genuinely and completely, the smile of someone who had fought her way back from the edge and emerged stronger. At dinner that night, Sarah stood to make a toast. I want to thank everyone here for being part of my journey, the ugly parts and the beautiful parts. To my parents, who never stopped believing in me even when I'd stopped believing in myself. To Judith and Harold, who could have walked away but instead chose to be the grandparents Emma deserved. To Jake, who loves me and Emma exactly as we are, messy histories and all. And to Emma, my reason for everything, my reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always something worth fighting for. She paused, her eyes finding Margaret's across the table. 5 years ago, I was standing on a street corner with a cardboard sign, convinced my life was over. I couldn't imagine ever feeling happy again, ever feeling safe, ever feeling like I had a future worth looking forward to. But here I am, a master's degree, a job I love, a family that supports me, and the knowledge that I'm strong enough to handle whatever comes next. That transformation didn't happen because of one dramatic rescue, but because of 1,000 small moments of love and support, and people refusing to let me give up on myself. So thank you. Thank you all for saving me, but more importantly, thank you for teaching me how to save myself. There wasn't a dry eye at the table. That night, after Emma was asleep and the celebration had wound down, Margaret found herself alone with Sarah on the balcony once again, just as they'd been years before. "Do you ever think about that day?" Margaret asked. "The day I found you?" "All the time," Sarah admitted. "But not the way I used to. At first I could only remember the shame, the fear, the feeling of having hit rock bottom. But now I think of it as the day everything started to change. The day I started climbing back up. The worst day and the beginning of the best days, all rolled into one. "Do you ever hear from David?" Margaret asked. It was a question she rarely posed, not wanting to dredge up painful memories. But curiosity got the better of her. "Occasionally," Sarah said. "He sends birthday cards to Emma. Child support payments. His parents make sure of that. He's still in Las Vegas, still working at the casino, still, as far as I know, not gambling, still alone. I used to hate him so much for what he did to us. But now I just feel sad for him, I guess. Sad that he's missing out on knowing this incredible kid we created. Sad that his shame and cowardice cost him his family. Sad that he never developed the strength to face what he'd done and try to make amends. Do you think you'll ever let him be part of Emma's life?" Sarah considered this carefully. Maybe someday, if he ever grows up enough to be someone worth knowing. But it would have to be on Emma's terms, when she's old enough to decide for herself if she wants a relationship with him. I won't keep him from her out of spite. But I also won't force a relationship that serves his needs rather than hers. She has plenty of people who love her. She doesn't need someone who'll disappoint her. "That seems very wise," Margaret said. "I learned from the best," Sarah replied with a smile. "You and Dad taught me what unconditional love looks like, what it means to show up for someone even when it's hard, even when they've made mistakes, even when it would be easier to walk away. That's the kind of parent I want to be for Emma. That's the kind of partner I'm learning to be for Jake. And that's the kind of social worker I'm trying to be for my clients." "Tell me about the work," Margaret said. "I know you've started your new position, but you haven't shared many details." Sarah's face lit up. "It's incredible, Mom. Hard, but incredible. I work with women who are in crisis, domestic violence, financial abuse, homelessness, addiction. Women who are right where I was 5 years ago, feeling like there's no way out. And I get to be the person who helps them see that there is a way out, that they're stronger than they know, that their circumstances don't define them." She leaned forward, her voice passionate. "And the best part is, I can tell them I've been there. Not just theoretically or academically, but actually been there. I've slept under bridges with a baby. I've chosen between feeding myself and feeding my child. I've felt the shame of begging strangers for money. And I've climbed out of all of that and built a life I'm proud of. That gives me a credibility with clients that no amount of academic training could provide." "You've turned your pain into purpose," Margaret observed. "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "That's exactly what I've done. And it feels redemptive, I guess. Like those horrible months weren't just wasted suffering, but preparation for something meaningful. Like Emma and I went through that fire so we could help other people find their way through their own fires." Margaret felt a swell of pride so intense it was almost physical. "You know what amazes me most about you?" "What?" "You've never played the victim. You've never used what happened to you as an excuse or a crutch. You've faced what happened honestly, done the work to heal from it, and then turned around and used it to help others. That takes a strength of character that I'm not sure I could have managed." "You would have," Sarah said confidently. "You did manage it in your own way. When Grandma died, you could have fallen apart. You had every reason to. But instead, you went to therapy. You worked through your grief, and you came out the other side stronger and more empathetic. You showed me how to do that, Mom. Everything I know about resilience I learned from watching you." They sat together in comfortable silence, mother and daughter, bound by shared history and mutual respect. "I'm getting married in 6 months," Sarah said suddenly. "I know we haven't set a date officially yet, but Jake and I talked about it, and we want a spring wedding. Small, intimate, just family and close friends. Will you help me plan it?" "I would be honored," Margaret said, her heart full. "Absolutely honored. And Mom? I want Emma to be my maid of honor. She's old enough now to understand what it means, to take the role seriously. I want her to stand beside me when I marry Jake, to be part of creating our new family." "Is that weird?" "It's not weird at all," Margaret assured her. "It's perfect. It's acknowledging that she's been your partner through everything, that you and Emma are a team. Including her in your marriage to Jake is a beautiful way to show that he's joining both of you, not just marrying you." "That's exactly how I feel," Sarah said with relief. "I'm so glad you understand." The next 6 months were a flurry of wedding planning conducted, largely over video calls and shared Pinterest boards. Margaret helped Sarah pick out dresses, sample cakes via photos, debate invitation wordings, and navigate all the small dramas that seemed to be inevitable in wedding planning. It was, Margaret thought, the kind of normal mother-daughter activity she'd once feared they'd never have again. The wedding took place on a sunny April afternoon in a small botanical garden in Seattle. Emma, in a pale pink dress that matched the bridesmaids' gowns, took her role as maid of honor very seriously. She held Sarah's bouquet during the ceremony, fluffed her train, and gave a short speech at the reception that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "I used to think families were just born," Emma said in her clear 7-year-old voice, reading from note cards she and Sarah had prepared together. "Sorry, but now I know they're made. My mom and I were born as family, but we made our family with Gamma and Grandpa and Grandma, Judith and Grandpa, Harold and all of you who loved us. And now Jake is making our family even bigger. And that's the best thing ever." Sarah and Jake's first dance was to a song about new beginnings, and Margaret watched them with joy in her heart. Jake was everything David hadn't been. Steady, present, honest. He adored Emma and treated her as his own. He supported Sarah's career ambitions and never tried to diminish her to make himself feel bigger. He had sat down with Margaret and Robert before proposing to Sarah, asking their blessing but also, movingly, asking their advice. "I know Sarah has been through hell," he'd said. "I know she's worked incredibly hard to get to where she is. I want to be a partner who builds her up, who celebrates her strength, who creates a safe space for her to keep growing. Can you help me understand what she needs?" Robert had looked at this earnest young man and said, "She needs exactly what you just described. Someone who sees her clearly, respects her journey, and walks beside her rather than trying to lead or follow. If you can do that, you'll do just fine." And so far, Jake was doing more than fine. Watching him dance with Emma after the first dance, spinning her around and making her giggle. Margaret felt confident that Sarah had chosen well this time. At the end of the reception, as guests were starting to drift away, Sarah pulled Margaret aside. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "You planned this whole beautiful wedding yourself. Not just for this, for everything. For the past 5 years, for raising me to be strong enough to survive what I survived, for showing me what love really looks like, for seeing me on that street corner and not walking past." Margaret cupped her daughter's face in her hands. "Sarah, my darling girl, I would walk through fire for you." Stopping on a street corner was nothing. It was everything, Sarah insisted. It was the difference between giving up and going on. It was the moment that changed the entire trajectory of Emma's life and mine. So thank you, for everything, always. 10 years after that day on the street corner, Margaret received a package in the mail. Inside was a book, a published memoir with Sarah's name on the cover, and a title that made Margaret's breath catch. The Corner of Grace, A Mother's Journey from Despair to Hope. Margaret opened it with trembling hands and found a dedication. For my mother, who saw me when I most needed to be seen. And for Emma, who gave me a reason to be seen. You are my corner of grace. She read the entire book in one sitting, tears streaming down her face as Sarah's words brought back every moment of those painful, beautiful years. Sarah had written with unflinching honesty about the gambling, the debts, the abandonment, the months on the street. But she'd also written about the strength she'd discovered, the helpers who'd appeared when most needed, the slow process of rebuilding. The final chapter was about the wedding, about creating a new family with Jake, about the life she'd built from the ashes of the old one. It ended with these words. People sometimes ask me if I regret the years with David. If I wish I could go back and choose differently, avoid the pain and trauma. The answer is complicated. I regret the pain, certainly. I regret the fear and the hunger and the months my daughter spent in unstable circumstances. But I can't regret the journey entirely. Because it taught me who I am. It taught me I'm stronger than I ever imagined. It taught me what real love looks like. Not the romantic fairy tale version, but the gritty, show up every day, hold on when everything is falling apart version. It taught me that rock bottom is a starting point, not an ending. And most importantly, it taught me about grace. The grace of a mother who looked past appearances to see her daughter in need. The grace of strangers who dropped coins in my cup. The grace of in-laws who chose to support rather than blame. Margaret had always considered herself a woman of composure. Through 32 years of marriage, the loss of her own mother, and the daily challenges of running a small accounting firm, she had maintained an admirable grace under pressure. Her friends often remarked on her steady demeanor, the way she could face a crisis with clear eyes and a level head. She was the person people called when they needed someone rational, someone who wouldn't fall apart when things got difficult. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for the sight of her daughter on that street corner. The day had started ordinarily enough. Margaret had left work early, grateful for a slow Friday afternoon that allowed her to run errands before the weekend rush. She'd stopped at the grocery store, carefully selecting ingredients for the pot roast Robert loved, picking up his favorite beer, treating herself to a bouquet of fresh flowers. Her mind was pleasantly occupied with domestic thoughts. Should she make garlic, mashed potatoes, or roasted vegetables? Did they have enough coffee for the weekend? Should she pick up that mystery novel everyone at book club had been raving about? The November air was crisp but not yet bitter, the kind of autumn day that made you grateful for a warm coat and the promise of a cozy evening ahead. Margaret had been thinking about dinner, mentally cataloging the contents of her grocery bags. Chicken breast for backup if Robert didn't want pot roast, fresh vegetables, a bottle of white wine for the weekend. She had been looking forward to a quiet evening at home with her husband, perhaps watching one of those British detective shows they both enjoyed, maybe calling Sarah to catch up since they hadn't spoken in nearly 2 weeks. Sarah. Her daughter had been distant lately, Margaret realized with a pang of guilt. Their weekly phone calls had become bi-weekly, then sporadic. Sarah's excuses had been reasonable enough. Busy with work, the baby keeping her occupied, David's new job demanding long hours. Margaret had accepted these explanations without pressing too hard, not wanting to be one of those intrusive mothers who couldn't let their adult children live their own lives. But there had been something in Sarah's voice during their last conversation, something strained and hollow that Margaret had noticed but hadn't pursued. Her mind was occupied with these thoughts when something made her glance to her right as she walked past the corner of 5th and Main at first. It was just a young woman with a baby, the kind of heartbreaking sight that had become too common in recent years. The city had its share of homeless individuals, and while Margaret always felt a pang of sympathy, she had learned, like most urban dwellers, to keep walking. You couldn't stop for everyone. You couldn't save everyone. You dropped change in cups when you could, donated to shelters, voted for politicians who promised to address the problem, and told yourself you were doing your part. But something about this woman's profile caught her attention in a way she couldn't immediately explain. It was subtle, visceral, the kind of recognition that happens in your bones before your brain can process it. The slope of her nose, familiar in a way that made Margaret's heart skip. The way she held her shoulders, slumped but with a particular curve that triggered memory. The particular shade of her hair, even dirty and tangled, sparked something deep in Margaret's maternal consciousness. Margaret's feet slowed without her conscious decision, her head turning for a better look. The woman was thin, painfully so, wearing clothes that hung loose on her frame, and looked like they hadn't been washed in days. She held a cardboard sign in one hand, the writing shaky but legible. Hungry. Please help. Baby needs formula. In her other arm, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a baby. Margaret could see a tiny fist curled against the woman's chest, could hear soft whimpering sounds that suggested the child was awake and uncomfortable. The woman's face was turned slightly away, her gaze fixed on the sidewalk, as if she couldn't bear to make eye contact with the people hurrying past. But that profile, that heartbreakingly familiar profile, made Margaret stop completely. Her rational mind was already throwing up objections. It couldn't be. Sarah was fine. Sarah had a good job and a husband and a nice apartment across town. But her mother's heart, that deep instinctive knowledge that transcends logic, was already screaming the truth. Sarah? The name escaped her lips as barely a whisper, a question and a prayer and a denial all wrapped into one desperate syllable.